Good evening, all. My name is Mehmet Sorel, and on behalf of the Advocates for Dignity, I would like to welcome you all to this evening's webinar. The Advocates for Dignity was launched in early 2018 by the former Premier of New South Wales, the Honourable Barry Unsworth, at a very iconic place for Sydney-siders called the Customs House. And since then, we have conducted a number of events to be the voice of the victims of Erdogan's Turkey. We have so far conducted 2 photo exhibitions, broadcast gala screenings of 2 documentary films, and conducted 4 webinars about the chaotic situation currently in Turkey. We have also conducted a fact-finding mission to Greece, Germany, and England to see firsthand the plight of the refugees who have fled Turkey to these countries. We have also opened a Sydney, Melbourne, and Perth chapter of the Advocates for Dignity. Before we begin, on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Advocates for Dignity, we would like to send our condolences to the families of the people who were either killed in the 2 catastrophic events that have happened in our world over the course of the last week. Firstly, we send our condolences to the loved ones of those who lost their lives in the attacks in France, and share our grief with the people of France and with everyone who considers themselves as a member of the human family. And secondly, we send our condolences to the families of the 39 people thus far who have been killed due to the earthquake tsunami in the 3rd largest city in Turkey, Izmir, only a few days ago. Our prayers are with them all, as well as with the whole of Turkey who are mourning their tragic deaths. Today is a special day. It is the United Nations International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. In the past 14 years, across the whole world, there have been more than approximately 1,200 journalists that have been killed for reporting the news and bringing information to the public. In 9 out of the 10 cases, the killers go unpunished, and impunity leads to more killings and is often a symptom of worsening conflict and the breakdown of law and judicial systems. To commemorate this special day, this evening's webinar titled "Why the End of Press Freedom Equals the End of Democracy: The Stories of Egypt and Turkey," we have 2 distinguished speakers who will be asked a series of questions by our panel moderator. Our speakers include Professor Peter Greste, who's the UNESCO Chair in Journalism and Communication at the University of Queensland. He's also the founding member of the advocacy group, the Alliance for Journalist Freedom. We also have Abdulhamit Bilici, who's a Turkish journalist and media executive. Bilici was one of the prominent and influential media figures in Turkey as the last editor-in-chief of Zaman, the country's most widely circulated newspaper. Our 2 speakers will be asked a series of questions by Andrew West, who is a journalist and broadcaster who currently presents the Religion and Ethics Report on ABC Radio National. Without further ado, I will introduce our facilitator for the webinar, Andrew West. Andrew West is a journalist and broadcaster who presents the Religion and Ethics Report on ABC. He was a senior reporter at the Sydney Morning Herald, the Sun Herald, and the Australian newspapers, and is the author of 2 books on Australian politics and culture, including a biography of the former Foreign Minister and New South Wales Premier, Bob Carr. I will now hand over to Andrew to introduce our 2 speakers. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very, very much, Mehmet. I want to just make an apology, first of all, for my either ghostly appearance here, the very odd lighting where I am, but I've traded off a good visual image for a better audio facility, because I think it's more important to hear what we say rather than trying to find a place that makes me look better, which would be impossible anyway. So ignore the visual, just concentrate on what we have to say. I'm really happy to be able to do this event tonight with 2 journalists who I think are not only outstanding journalists, but also very brave people, very courageous people. Because in both cases, in the case of Peter Greste and Abdulhamit Bilici, they have stood against the might of governments. And this is an increasingly difficult thing that journalists are called to do, to stand against the might of a government. Now, it's one thing in a country like Australia, or even the United States, where you do have a president who is very critical of journalists who don't like him. It's one thing to take a position in opposition to governments in democratic countries, where there is usually no life-threatening situation that flows from that, nothing that threatens your liberty. But to do as Abdulhamit and Peter have both done, and that is to take a stand against governments where they have authoritarian powers, is an enormously impressive thing. In the case of Peter, of course, it was an extremely sacrificial thing, and we'll ask him about that. So I just want to introduce them both briefly, but I'm going to ask them a bit about their careers rather than simply have me talk about it. But first of all, Professor Peter Greste. Peter is now the professor he holds the UNESCO chair in journalism and communications at the University of Queensland, which is one of the top 100 universities in the world. Peter has a long and distinguished record. He was a journalist with the BBC, and of course, he became most famous as a journalist for Al Jazeera. It was in that role where Peter ultimately had to sacrifice 400 days of his freedom in an Egyptian jail. Abdulhamit Bilici was the editor-in-chief of Zaman, which was Turkey's most popular newspaper, most widely read newspaper. He was also the chief executive, I think it's Feza Publications, which was a leading Turkish media company, an independent media company. In 2016, after there was a failed coup in Turkey, the Prime Minister, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, used that failed coup, as an opportunity to crack down very severely on press freedom. And Abdulhamit will tell us about the consequences of many journalists in Turkey. For Abdulhamit, the consequence was exile. He didn't have the chance to stay in the country that he loved, the country of his birth, the country where he had worked in a very distinguished way as a journalist. Abdulhamit was first forced into exile. I suppose, given a choice between exile and jail, as we'll hear from Peter, it was a relatively easy choice, but it's not a choice that any journalist should be forced to make. Let's start with Peter. Peter, you've had a very distinguished career as a journalist. It's certainly not over. It's taken a new phase as a professor. Peter won Peabody Awards. He's won the Walkley Award numerous times. Peter, first of all, tell us, how did you end up in Egypt? And how did you end up in a position where the Egyptian government was able to arrest you and jail you for 400 days?
Well, thanks, Andrew. It's a very generous introduction. I was working in Egypt for Al Jazeera, as you mentioned earlier, just covering the Christmas New Year period at the end of 2013 into 2014. My main bureau, the place I worked out of, was Nairobi, covering mostly East Africa, East and Central Africa. And so I really had very little experience of Egypt. I was really only the poor mug that had nothing better to do over that Christmas New Year period, and went over to cover the unfolding political crisis. And just to refresh everyone's memory, of course, we had the January 25th revolution, which toppled Hosni Mubarak. There were elections. The Muslim Brotherhood was the first democratically elected government in the country's history. They survived for about a year before there was a widespread protest and a military coup that forced them out of power in the middle of 2013. And so when I arrived, we saw ongoing protests between rival political supporters. And the government was starting to accuse the Muslim Brotherhood of being involved in acts of terrorism. Now, the Brotherhood at the time hadn't officially been banned. And of course, we were doing what any responsible journalist would do. The government would announce some changes to the constitution. We would then pick up the phone and call the opposition, which of course at that point was the party that was last in power, the Muslim Brotherhood. And then we'd find an analyst to make sense of it all. But it was in the act of speaking to the Brotherhood, and giving them a voice, giving them an opportunity to express their views and their opinions, that really gave the government an opportunity to describe us as being advocates for a terrorist organization, for promoting and publishing terrorist ideology. Now, at the time, it was fairly early on in what's now become known as the sissification of Egypt's media environment, where anybody
named after General Al-Sisi, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, anyone involved, anyone who was not supportive has been arrested or imprisoned, or the news organizations have been shut down. But it's the way in which I think, and this is what we've seen reflected not just in Egypt, of course, but as Abdulhamit will explain, very much in Turkey, in the way in which national security has been used as an excuse to come after uncomfortable journalism. I think that's really the uniting theme across all of the countries where we've seen these kinds of pressures.
Yeah, Peter, the important thing to point out was when you interviewed members of the Muslim Brotherhood, you weren't there you weren't there giving them an unfettered, unquestioning platform. You weren't there to just give them the microphone.
No, of course not.
The point was you were there to just simply do your job as a diligent journalist. And that involved asking the Muslim Brotherhood challenging questions. But that very act of simply putting their face on television was considered sedition.
That's right. It was considered to be advocating terrorist ideology, even though, as you rightly say, we were doing our job as journalists and asking difficult, skeptical questions of the Brotherhood as much as we were of the government. That's what our responsibility is as a journalist. And just to emphasize that, you know, and you would know, and Abdulhamit, I'm sure, knows this very well too, that when you're familiar with the story, you start to get to know how far you can push the boundaries of a story before you end up with pushback. But because I didn't know Egypt very well, I wasn't that familiar with the story, I really kept it to a very straight, narrow line, as neutral as we could possibly make it. But simply giving the Brotherhood and their supporters a platform by simply giving them an opportunity to explain their position and questioning them on that, and pushed us over the line as far as the government was concerned.
So before we come to Abdulhamit, just tell us, what were the circumstances in which you were arrested? What was the trigger? Was there a trigger interview there, Peter, that sort of set off the regime?
To this day, I still have no idea, Andrew. It never came up in evidence. Anyone who watched the trial would have recognized there was no evidence of our stories that was ever presented that would have suggested, would have pointed to the charges. All I know was what we were accused of, and that's aiding and abetting a terrorist organization, financing a terrorist organization, being members of a terrorist organization, and broadcasting fake news with intent to undermine national security. And so, you know, it's, as I said, to this day, I really don't know what the trigger was. The best I can assume, the best I can surmise, is that someone decided that they wanted to act against journalists, and they decided then that we were the easiest targets to go after immediately after they'd made that decision.
Yeah. So what happened? Because you've written about this in a book that I'll recommend, that I do recommend. But what happened on the day that you were arrested?
Oh, I was in my hotel room about to go out for dinner with a friend of mine from the BBC who I hadn't seen for some years. There was a knock on the door. It was unusual to have knocks on the door, and if anyone wanted me, then they almost always used the telephone. I cracked open the door, and as I did, it was pushed inside, flung in as if there was a powerful spring behind it. And the room was filled with about 8 or 10 guys who ransacked the room, searched it, grabbed all of my equipment and marched me off down, placed me under arrest. And I discovered very quickly that my colleagues, Mohammed Fahmy and Bahar Mohammed, had also been arrested. And from that point on, it all went downhill. We were placed into police cells. We went for interrogation. We learnt the charges. And then, as you know, we wound up on trial and were formally convicted of those terrorism offences.
I'm going to come back to that story. Abdulhamit, tell us first of all about the role of the newspaper Zaman, because it was associated with the Gulen movement. The Gulen movement, though, was a very widespread civil society movement. And Erdogan's government was initially tolerant of the Gulen movement. But tell us about Zaman and how it saw itself in the context of Turkish media.
So thank you for the opportunity to share my story and to highlight the importance of press freedom. So it is a long story, but to cut it short, The Gülen movement or the Hizmet movement is one of very active participants of Turkish society, civil society. So it has a history of maybe 40 years, starting by 70s, and was very much active in education, opening schools in Turkey, giving modern education, and around the world, over 150 countries, they have been active in educating kids, especially who are talented but don't have the means for a modern, a good education. And they were very active in charity, social charity activities, and media, and some other activities. And the Gülen himself is a Muslim scholar, and who was initiating interfaith dialogue activities, reaching to other religious leaders like Pope or the Jewish leaders in Turkey and around the world. So, I mean, this is he was an initiator of support for interfaith dialogue and democratization in Turkey.
But,
so that is very important, because when you consider Turkey, democracy was interrupted 5 times in the last 50 years, every 10 years. So that's a very important goal, to reach to a full-fledged democracy. And the Gülen movement with all power was supporting that initiative. And in those years that Erdogan government was also in a democratic path, there was a kind of a time that the movement, the Hizmet movement, the Gülen movement, and the Erdogan's party was acting in the same way.
Yeah.
But when Erdogan drifted to an authoritarian politics, then that relationship ended, and the Erdogan turned against the movement. That is the short story.
Yeah. But did Zaman, as a newspaper, a mainstream newspaper, but did it see itself as the voice of the Gülen movement, or did it see itself as a newspaper with a broad sort of editorial sympathy for the goals of the Gülen movement? But did Zaman ever write critically from time to time of the Gülen movement?
So the paper was, as you said in the beginning, in the introduction, was the largest newspaper, and it was trying to support democratic effort in Turkey of the civil society and of the government, and supporting the Erdogan government for the years that Erdogan was doing right things. And it is affiliated with the Gülen movement, but it was not a kind of speaker of the movement, but it was a regular, normal newspaper, which some editors, some columnists had, relationship with the movement. So it was not championing or making the propaganda of the movement, but it was a journalist. It was a journal, newspaper, that was initiated by the people who has the money to invest in media that will be a voice for people and for democracy and for interfaith understanding. But it was appreciated by people and became an important platform for a lot of voices in Turkey. I mean, in a regular day, in my newspaper, you could see a Kurdish intellectual, a liberal intellectual, a social democrat intellectual sharing their views freely, which was a very important celebration of, pluralism, let's say, which was very much supported by the Gülen's ideas as well.
Tell me what happened on the 16th of March, 2016. We know that there was a failed coup, I think in June or July 2016.
It was in July.
In July. But what happened on March the 5th, 2016?
So it is the last day of our struggle against the government. You know, as I said, my newspaper was supporting Erdogan government when it was supported by whole international media and democratic powers like the European Union, Australia, or America. They were all supportive. Le Monde was supporting, New York Times was supporting, because Turkey at that time was a shining star of democracy. It was rising as a model of Muslim democracy. And in those years, we were very much supportive, but it changed until after 2011, 12, 13, whichever year you like to accept as a turning point. But this is the turning from a democratic path into a one-man regime, which put us into a difficult position, because Erdogan did not like us to be critical of the authoritarian policies and the corruption that was revealed to a very great extent related to his family members and his ministers at high levels. So
yeah, and there were investigations into his son, I believe, that he didn't like.
Yeah, in 2013.
Yeah,
and from 2013 until March 5th, 2016, for 3 years, we had a very important journalistic struggle to tell truth to power. But of course, we triggered the anger of Erdogan government and Erdogan regime. And this started by revoking our press cards that for our reporters to cover events in the capital, in Ankara, the press events of any minister, Erdogan himself. So this was the beginning. But then it followed by a call for boycotting our newspaper, canceling the advertisements and pressuring the private companies not to purchase advertisements, sending us tax inspectors, opening a lot of court cases against the newspaper, against the reporters, the columnists, threatening us for shutdown. So all these were intimidation tactics to force us to change our line, to make us stop criticizing the government. If we accepted, I would not be in exile today, and my reporters will not be in jail today, and my newspaper was surviving. Yeah. So since we did not change our line of criticizing the mistakes of Erdogan government, so he used on 5th of March the nuclear option. They appointed by a kangaroo court some trustees to the board of our company, and they came by a police force, invaded the newspaper, and we were protesting, but we did not have anything to stop them. We are just journalists. We had only cameras and pens and pencils. So they occupied the newspaper, and they kicked us out, and they fired me as the editor at that time, of the last editor of Zaman Daily. And they hired the other day a mouthpiece journalist, and in 24 hours, they made the newspaper a mouthpiece, a propaganda machine of the newspaper, of the government. But this is not a story related or specific to my newspaper. So before us, in 2015, even 1 year before they silenced us, they silenced other critical media outlets like the TV channels, news agencies, newspapers. And this is, many people in the West, in the world, think that there has been a coup attempt in July 2016, and Erdogan used that as an opportunity to silence the media. This is not the case. Coup is the last nail on the democracy of Turkey.
Yeah.
So that's very important to make the correction.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that. I want to now complete Peter's story. Because, Peter, so now you've been arrested with your colleagues from Al Jazeera. You've been charged with this litany of offences. And you begin what is ultimately 400 days detention. Just briefly, Peter, what were the conditions under which you were held? And did you sense that you were there simply as let us say, a teachable moment for other journalists who might dare to question?
A teachable moment is a very good way of describing it, Andrew. I've never heard it quite like that, but yes, I think that's probably the way I'd consider it.
Yeah.
Look, as I mentioned earlier, the problem for us was trying to reconcile the gap between the really serious charges that you've just alluded to, the terrorism charges on the one hand, and the reality of what, frankly, I thought was fairly ordinary journalism on the other. You know, that I couldn't really see how those two had come. Anyone could bring those two together. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that, in fact, the only thing it could be was that they were using us as an example. They were coming after us as to send a very clear message that it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a foreigner, whether you're a local, whether you're Egyptian or Australian, and if you push or promote or give a platform to the Brotherhood or their ideas, then you're going to be targeted. And in fact, that's turned out to be the case. We've seen now, I think as of December last year, the CPJ counted 26 journalists that have been arrested in Egypt. That's it's nowhere near the numbers that we've seen in Turkey, but it's still amongst the most prolific in the world. And the conditions were pretty extreme. The first cell I was in was a police cell, about 8 foot square, tiny little concrete box with no furniture, nothing, and there were 16 guys that were squeezed into that tiny box. It was absolutely horrendous. And then I went from there, from the frying pan into the fire, and I went into a period of solitary confinement for weeks on end. I was kept in a political prison alongside some of the more significant leaders of the January 26th revolution. People like Allah Abdul Fattah, who is still in prison, Ahmed Doma, a poet in Egypt who is also still in prison, other well-known leaders who are all the secular leaders really who are behind it. And then I moved into another supermax prison alongside a lot of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood as well. And so it was pretty tough. We were locked up for 23 hours a day in that cell. Not conditions that I would ever want anybody else to go through, to be honest with you. But as I said, Andrew, I never took it personally. I felt that we were there not because of anything we had done, but because of what we had come to represent. And that was press freedom. As you said, it was an opportunity to send a very clear message to other journalists.
Abdulhamit, so to complete your story, how many of your colleagues ended up in jail, and how were you able to flee into exile?
So I left country when they took over the newspaper and fired me. So in 2 weeks, I was told that Turkey is not safe and secure for me. And because I was already getting a lot of threats for life or to imprison me. So one of the regular form of threat was prepare your bag for jail. So, I mean, if I did not leave, of course, I will end up to be in jail in July after the coup.
Right.
So my home was raided on 27th of July, the day that 54 other reporters, columnists of my newspaper, their homes were also raided. Luckily, I was not at home at that time, so I was fortunate not to be jailed. But the unfortunate side, of course, a lot of our reporters and columnists were in Turkey in their homes at that time, and they were arrested. And some of them very young reporters, some of them are very important intellectuals. For instance, we had a poet as our columnist who was in his 80s.
Well, we all know how dangerous an 80-year-old poet can be, don't we?
Yeah, can you imagine? And he had a heart attack during the detention. So because of that, I guess it was shameful for them. Yeah. And then they released him after keeping him a couple of days under police detention. But we had also another columnist who was a professor of politics, but he was also happened to be our columnist, our writer. So he was in jail for more than 4 years. He released very recently after some pledge from some members, coalition partners of the Erdogan. So currently, Turkey jails more than 140 journalists. So these are different, these people have different backgrounds. Some of them worked in our newspaper, in our news agency, in our media outlet. Some of them has nothing to do with Gülen. Some of them are liberal, some of them are Kurds, some of them are socialists, very different backgrounds. But the common thing that put them into jail is their critical positions against the government. And of course, Turkey ranking now 154 out of 180 countries. So it is, I mean, one of the worst jailer of journalists. Even, you know, I listened to the very tragic story of my colleague from who was jailed in Egypt. I see that, I mean, it's very hypocritical that Erdogan defends the rights of some Egyptian people against what Sisi does, you know, but himself does worse, horrible things in his own country. So that is, I mean, the figures of the jailed journalists is more than even Egypt or some other notorious countries.
Well, let's stay in Turkey, but I'll also ask Peter to come in on this, because the situation in Turkey appears to sort of summarize the whole theme of this discussion, which is why the end of press freedom threatens the end of democracy. So in relation to Turkey, why is this question so important? Why is the crackdown on press freedom in Turkey emblematic of the crackdown on democracy? Because we still do, on a superficial level, see voting occur in Turkey, you know, and I think, you know, in the case of the mayoralty of Istanbul, when Erdogan's party lost that election, and then they had the election again and they lost by an even bigger margin, we still do see certain flickers of democracy. But in Turkey, what does the crackdown on journalism say about the democratic or the end of the democratic impulse in Turkey?
You know, some politicians, some experts name this as illiberal democracy. You know, there is the facade of democracy, but in the essence, you don't have the real functions of democracy, including press freedom. So, you know, when the pressure or the oppression started against media in 2013, many people, the political parties or lawyers or the people in the judiciary or in business, they were thinking that this is a kind of conflict between journalists and the government. At that time, we were telling that this is the beginning of the oppression against all people who happen to be against the government's policies. So we were saying that let's unite together. You know, don't leave journalists to defend democracy alone, because they can't. The journalists cannot defend democracy if political parties, bar associations, civic society, trade unions are not supporting them. So unfortunately, Turkish society was not able to come together to defend democracy altogether. And Erdogan, one by one, destroyed critical voices in media, at the same time created a mouthpiece media. Today, I mean, in last 5 years, with that destruction of free media and creation of a mouthpiece media, made Erdogan the biggest media boss now. He controls 95% of media. And now we came to a point where the lawyers are in jail, judges are in jail, business people are in jail, even the sports people, you know, has nothing political, are also in jail. So, I mean, when democracy, when a notorious leader like to create a one-man system, authoritarian politics, it starts with destroying media, but it doesn't end there. This is very important message to be understood. And this is very strange because this is not a military destroying free media. This is a popularly elected government destroying media. This is a new kind for us as well. In our past, in Turkey, we had the oppression against media during the military interventions or by some judiciary elements, etc. These were bureaucratic. But this new kind is a populist leader getting support from the people and then cracking down the opposition, and then this creating a media to brainwash people. So that's a very new phenomenon, in my view.
Peter, you've got the UNESCO Chair of Journalism and Communications. So the United Nations clearly sees the question of press freedom as an imperative. From your position, studying press freedom and the threats to press freedom all around the world, let's step back just from the cases of Turkey and Egypt. Where else do you see press freedom under attack, and where does that represent a threat to greater democratic freedoms?
Look, it's much more widespread than I think most people really appreciate. A big part of it is, as I mentioned, the idea of securitization of the media, or of the message, if you like. We've seen
where you mean securitization, where governments try to co-opt the media as part of the national security effort?
Both co-opt it as part of the national security effort, but also use national security as an opportunity to control the message and therefore silence uncomfortable journalism.
Yeah.
Of course, we've been talking about Egypt and Turkey. We've been hearing from Abdulhamit some fairly confronting story of how national security has come after or has been used to silence journalism. But as you and I both know, here in Australia, we're seeing a similar trend. Last year, we saw journalists from 2 news organisations raided by the Australian Federal Police for stories that relied on confidential and classified documents, but in neither case they exposed anything that was damaging to national security. And in both cases, they were stories that were incontrovertibly in the public interest. Now, I'm not suggesting that Australia is about to become Turkey or Egypt anytime soon, but what I am saying is that the political imperatives that have allowed governments in Turkey and Egypt to create loosely framed national security legislation, which has then been used to come after uncomfortable journalism, are the same political imperatives that are driving the Australian government to do exactly the same thing. The Australian government isn't anywhere near as extreme as Egypt or Turkey, of course, and the motives, I think, are a little bit different. But as I said, the political imperative, the international drive or focus on security, particularly since the war on terror began after 9/11, I think has really changed the dynamic and created a lot of these opportunities.
Yeah.
What that does is it has, of course, a very direct impact. And again, as we've been discussing Turkey and Egypt, we can see exactly what that does for press freedom. But in places like Australia, the United States, and other Western democracies, what it does is not necessarily place journalists in prison, but it has a demonstrably chilling effect. It closes down the space that journalists are able to operate in. And we're seeing a lot of similar trends around COVID as well, by the way, where governments have used COVID and national security, the need to control the message in the face of the pandemic, as an opportunity to silence uncomfortable or confronting journalism in ways that go far beyond their original intent. And that really does have a damaging effect on journalism.
We've got a question from one of the viewers, and it's 20 minutes to 8. So I would ask people, if they'd like to ask a question, to start sending them in now. But this goes to the question about public broadcaster, I guess, versus state broadcaster. And the question is about Al Jazeera. Those of us who watch Al Jazeera English, the organization for which you worked, over the years would have seen a pretty straight up and down kind of news service. But in the back of our minds was like, oh, well, it's funded by the Qatari government. But also as a journalist, I'm thinking, well, the Qatari government wants to create something akin to the BBC or the ABC. Do you see any problems today? And it's been quite a while since you've worked for Al Jazeera, but do you see any problems, for example, with, say, Al Jazeera today?
Look, I'm going to have to, and I know I'm likely to be accused of dodging the question, but the fact is I never worked out of Qatar. I never worked out of Doha or had to report on the Qatari government. So I wasn't in a position to see or experience any kind of pressure specifically related to Al Jazeera's coverage of Qatar. Having said that, I obviously there will be anxiety and pressure for those journalists that are covering stories in Qatar. But again, to be honest with you, I never saw it. I was never personally aware of it. That's always going to be the test, isn't it, of an independent broadcaster. It's one thing for an international broadcaster to be covering stories in other parts of the world. And I really think that's something that Al Jazeera has done very well. But it's always going to be the test of how it covers the country in which it's based.
Yeah.
Al Jazeera, I think, has in the past done some fairly solid coverage, for example, of corruption around the its winning of the World Cup bid. And there's been some fairly uncomfortable stories about the way that Labor, for example, has been used on World Cup construction sites. So I won't say that it's been without blemish, but I think it's actually been reasonably solid. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I needed.
That's all right, Peter. But do you? I mean, just generally, did you get a sense that on Al Jazeera, the Arabic language channel, there was a subtle expectation that we are the voice of the Arab world and we need to be supportive of it in a way, for example, that you as a journalist on the English language service, a service that, as I say, on first and second glance, looked pretty solid. Did you get a sense that there was a different mission for the two sort of sets of journalists?
I won't say there was necessarily a different mission. What I will say is that I think there was a different political culture. There was a different journalistic culture. And I think that's true of any human organization. You tend to get cultures that evolve around the newsroom as you have those kinds of newsroom debates. Excuse me, I was never aware of and never really saw direct political interference, but I think there was a clear sense of purpose, a sense of mission from the Al Jazeera Arabic service, which I don't think was editorially sound. I think they let their political culture override a lot of the journalistic integrity, and I think that was problematic. I think we could also make the same arguments about news organizations such as Fox, for example.
Yeah.
In a very strong political culture within that news organization, Fox News in the United States. Others have made the same allegations about the Murdoch press here in Australia, and they've even made it about the ABC as well. So again, I'm not trying to brush off.
No, understand.
Problems, but what I'm saying is that this is a difficult challenge that news organizations always seem to confront.
Now, there's a couple of questions here for Abdulhamit, which I will just try to work out. They're pretty specific. If you just bear with me. Abdulhamit, Aval, the news chief editor at Yavuz Baydar, indicated none of his work was censored while working at today's Zaman. We also read pieces on the Kurdish fighters by Beyjan Matur that formed a kind of sympathy for the Kurdish movement in Turkey. However, we also hear stories that some columnists who were somehow related to the movement experienced some form of censorship. I'm not exactly sure where this question is relating to, but I guess the question is, Abdulhamit, was there ever any censorship, if not outright before the government takeover of Zaman?
Not a censorship, but of course, this is a learning process. At the same time, it's a persecution process. Out of every persecution, you learn a lot of things. So one of the things that I learned that our relationship with government has been much more, let's say, subtle than we had. We thought that the oppression against democracy is coming from the bureaucracy, especially from military. So we saw that elected government supporting democracy and pushing Turkey towards European Union membership was so great, and we should support that government. So in that, we should have kept our critical distance even when we were supporting them. But at that time, Erdogan's party and his government was very much under pressure from this bureaucratic establishment. Even, for instance, in 2008, there has been an attempt by the judiciary to shut down the party of Erdogan, which was very popular, which was getting the support of more than 40% of people. So because of that, our editorial approach was much taking aim against this oligarchic, bureaucratic, military establishment, not the government, because the government was sometimes also victim of that oppression in those years. But even in those years, I do some self-critique, saying that we should be keeping our journalistic critical approach to the party that was supporting democratic policies. So in that sense, and I now criticize myself that making a civilian elected government too powerful sometimes is a big problem, because you should never underestimate the importance of checks and balance in a democracy. Now I learned that as a general like Sisi could be a problem for democracy, who is coming from a military background. But if there is no check and balance in a system, in a political system, and popularly elected person could be the same level of danger for any democracy. So that was a learning process for me. And I did not get the question what it means, but there are lots of reporters and columnists that worked in my newspaper, and they could tell their stories if there has been any censorship. I guess there you will hear no such examples. So we were celebrating being the voice of people, especially who did not have a chance to speak their minds in the mainstream media. For instance, in Turkey, there is 80,000 Armenians who had tough times. But our newspaper, my newspaper, gave platform to an Armenian intellectual to share their perspective, not as a quota, for Armenians, but as an intellectual with his name openly, publicly, telling his perspective. And because of that, we got a lot of critiques from the conservative nationalist people that why you give platform to such voices. That's what we were telling, that since we are supporting interfaith dialogue and democracy, as a newspaper, we should do it with our deeds, it should not be just lip service. You should practice it.
Yeah.
And this was the way that we were practicing democracy and freedom. But as I said, it's a learning process as well. I'm learning a lot about the importance of press freedom now than I had when I was in a powerful position. So I hope we can learn from some of our mistakes for better democracy of our country and
yes,
the world.
Yeah, I'm thanking people for their questions. I'm having a little trouble deciphering a number of questions where the one question comes in about half a dozen parts, but I'll do my best. This is again to Abdulhamit. What are your thoughts on the different treatment of the international human rights community between Zaman's journalists and the exiled Kurdish leftist journalists of Turkey?
I mean, you know, if you are a journalist affiliated with Zaman, you are double persecuted. First, for being critical of the government, Erdogan. So in that, you are equal with the leftist Kurdish journalist as well. But since the Gülen movement, the Hizmet movement, is labeled as a terrorist organization, so because of that affiliation, you are persecuted second time. So for a journalist, if there is no such affiliation, I mean, the people in Turkey and in the world feel, I mean, closer or easier to support them. Because if they support a journalist who is also affiliated, a critical journalist who is also affiliated with the Gülen movement, and the government is easily using this as a pretext to do anything that they can do to that organization, to that civil society, whatever. So there is, and this is very important, and I understand, I respect that. But there is also a bias, you know. I mean, when you look at the human rights advocates in Turkey and around the world, you see that they tend to prioritize some groups over some others because of their ideological baggages, you know. That is a fact. I mean, we should understand. But this is an important problem that we had in Turkey. You know, when we were persecuted, some of our colleagues thought that this is something related to a conflict, a power struggle between the Erdogan and the Hizmet Gülen. And they thought that this oppression, this persecution will not come to them. And they were silent when we were persecuted. But their newspapers later were shut down too. They have been also jailed later too. So that ideological friction or the polarization is not helping to journalists, but it helps those authoritarian dictators, you know.
Yeah,
that's very important. I mean, yes, we can have our differences. I may be a Gülen affiliated journalist, you may be a Kurdish one, the other may be a liberal, but I mean, we should be able to come together to defend press freedom, the basic rule of law. These are common things, and I see in the country that I am in exile now, in America, for instance. I mean, I see that the journalists sometimes are polarized according to their political views. If they are supporting Trump, they think differently, or if they are against Trump, they act differently. This is a trap, you know. This is a trap that we should be very careful not to be, trapped with that.
Indeed. Question which we might have to make our last question is to Peter. And it's about Kevin Rudd's petition, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's petition seeking a royal commission into the influence of the Murdoch media. He's called it a cancer on democracy in Australia. Interesting challenge here, Peter, because here's a case where we've got a private company, News Corporation, which owns about 65 to 70% of titles in the country. But it's been that way since I was a copy boy in my gap year in 1987 at the Daily Mirror. I think the News Corporation's always had 60% plus of Australia's titles, not circulation, but titles. But an interesting question here, Peter. We're talking here about governments that crack down on the media. Is there a case for a government to regulate a private sector media organisation that its critics, and I'm not saying this is the case, but a private sector media organisation that its critics claim is undermining democracy?
Well, Andrew, it's an interesting question. It keeps coming up. One of the things I think there's been a bit of misdirection. Kevin Rudd in his petition has focused or has singled out News Corp, but the petition itself calls for an inquiry into media ownership in Australia, the concentration of media ownership. And as you well know, there's Murdoch, of course, and News Corporation is by far and away the biggest media owner in this country, but there's also Channel 9, or the 9 network, the 9 newspapers and television stations and so on. And between them, they really dominate Australian media. It's no secret that Australian media is the most concentrated in the democratic world. And I think on that basis alone, there is reason to argue that the government should be regulating to make sure that we do have a diversity of views. We had government regulation for many, many years up until the internet really made a mockery of some of the ownership, or the rules around ownership and access and so on, which were the reasons that those rules were introduced in the first place. But I think there really is a case to investigate the concentration of media ownership and whether or not this is undermining democracy. Personally, I think that it does make things worse. It does cause problems. But I tend to agree with Kevin that issue needs to be investigated. I'm slightly wary of focusing too much on News Corp, because then it becomes a rather polarized political debate. The underlying issue, though, remains that media diversity of ownership is a critical issue, and I on that basis, I think I agree with Kevin Rudd.
Yeah. Thank you so much to both of you. I really appreciate it. I think Mehmet wants to come back, and we've ended up having a conversation where we didn't get as many questions, but we, I think, got a lot of great answers. And I appreciate those of you who sent questions in, but I most assuredly want to thank Abdulhamit and Peter for their time and sharing their stories, because this is a very important day and it goes to a much broader question about democracy at a time when there's a lot of retrenchment of democracy. So thank you, Mehmet, for hosting this.
Yes, thank you, Andrew, very much appreciated. You've done a great job, all of you. And thank you to our two speakers, Peter and Abdulhamit, for the great insights you have given to our listeners on why the end of press freedom spells the end of democracy. And by looking at the case studies of two of the largest Muslim majority nations in the world, in Turkey and Egypt, we have a living example of this. Isn't it ironic that in both Egypt and Turkey, two religious civil society movements in Brotherhood and Hizmet, respectively, were shut down by dictatorship regimes, and to think that both the despotic leaders of these two nations also hate each other very much. They both have a very similar mindset in that they got rid of the biggest civil society groups and called them terrorists, just so that they can rule without anyone questioning them. Thank you, Professor Peter Greste, for the great insights about your journey in Egypt and how you were unfairly jailed. It is sad that you were jailed for no reason, except to set an example on others. And thank you to also Abdulhamit Bilici. You're a living example of a journalist who was unfairly prosecuted in Turkey and was forced to flee and migrate to the US. And when voices like yours are forced to be shut, then people will be misinformed and country will leave the path of democracy and head into the path of dictatorship or despotic leadership. Thank you to Mr. Andrew West for the insightful questions you have asked, as you always do, to further educate our viewers. Finally, I'd like to thank our viewers for taking the time from their busy schedule to watch our fourth webinar. I look forward to you at our next event, which will also be a webinar, so please look out for our upcoming events on our website. Good evening, everyone, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we are currently offline.